مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. اتجهت الانتخابات الرئاسية التركية إلى جولة إعادة بعد دورة أولى تقدم فيها الرئيس الحالي رجب طيب أردوغان على منافسه كليجدار أوغلو، لكنه فشل في تجاوز عتبة 50% المطلوبة للفوز بالسباق. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة ينضم إلينا السفير إريك إيدلمان، وهو السفير الأمريكي الأسبق في تركيا. أستاذ إريك، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for having me.
دائما في جولات الإعادة تميل كفة الحظ إلى المرشح الجالس على كرسي الرئاسة أردوغان في هذه الحالة، هل تتفق؟
Yes, I do. I think that President Erdogan has a huge advantage in the second round of this election for the following reasons. Well, first of all, uh, there's never been a fair playing field in Turkey because the government has always had outsized influence on the media, but in President Erdogan's Turkey, that media dominance is almost complete. So he already starts with a very large media advantage. Second, I think in light of the polling the weekend before the election last Sunday that showed the opposition coalition led by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu not only ahead of President Erdogan, but having a majority that would have put him into the presidency without a second round runoff. I think that the opposition is very demoralized by the results on Sunday. And I don't think they have a plan B, frankly, for how to fight this next 2 weeks runoff election campaign. Third, I think Turks have very not fond memories, I would say, of divided government, coalition governments in the 1990s. And since President Erdogan's party and coalition won a pretty comfortable majority in the parliamentary election on Sunday, I think he'll be able to argue pretty persuasively to the Turkish people that they don't want to have a divided government. So for all of those reasons, I think that he really is the odds-on favorite now to win the election.
باعتقادك هل لا يهتم الأتراك بالاقتصاد والتضخم والأزمة النقدية؟
You know, it's a very good question because President Erdogan's mismanagement of the Turkish economy has led to a very severe inflation and a currency crisis, a long-standing and lingering currency crisis because the Turkish lira has been devalued so much because of his insistence on keeping interest rates low. And that has really, I think, created a very serious economic crisis in the country. One would have expected, as a result of that, that Turkish voters would have punished him after 20 years in power for that mismanagement. And by the way, not just mismanagement of the economy, but also mismanagement of COVID and mismanagement of the relief of the terrible earthquake that Turkey suffered a few months ago. So his management in terms of the election being a referendum on his stewardship of Turkey as its president, you would think would have made it very tough for him. But he was able, I think, to trump that by essentially populist appeals, turning on the credit spigot, spending a lot of money from government coffers to provide benefits to voters, including a few days before the election, raising the salaries of public employees by 45% and appealing to nationalism. So the populist nationalist appeal, I think, trumped the pocketbook issues.
هناك أيضا من ربط سبب ترجيح كفة أردوغان بالبعد الثقافي والديني في البلاد، هل تتفق؟
Yes, I think that certainly was an element. I think, President Erdogan's appeal to culturally conservative voters and to his Islamist base, because, his roots in Turkish politics are in Islamist parties that have advocated a political role for Islam in Turkish society, which has been very secular since Ataturk, of course, back in the 1920s. So undoubtedly that played some role in his election. I don't know that it was the decisive role, but it certainly was a big part of it.
ذكرت أن المعارضة لا تملك خطة باء أو استراتيجية للأيام المقبلة. هل يمكن أن تفصل أكثر في نقاط ضعفها؟
Well, the opposition is a kind of somewhat unwieldy coalition of six parties, including a couple of parties that are splinter groups from the MHP, the Nationalist Party, that is a part of President Erdogan's coalition, and also two splinter parties from President Erdogan's AKP, his Justice and Development Party. The candidate whom they nominated for president, Kılıçdaroğlu, who is the head of the CHP, the People's Republican Party, the old Atatürkist party, was by almost everybody's assessment the weakest of the possible candidates that they could have put up against Erdogan. He's a longtime government bureaucrat. He doesn't have a lot of personal charisma. He also is an Alevi, so he is part of a minority group inside Turkey, which is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, and so he had a lot of deficiencies as a candidate, and those I think turned out to be telling, and that's one reason why they have no plan B, because they're stuck with Kılıçdaroğlu as their candidate, rather than a candidate who might have perhaps had more appeal, like Ekrem İmamoğlu, the young mayor of Istanbul, or Mansur Yavaş, the mayor of Ankara, both of whom consistently polled better against Erdogan than Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu did.
باعتقادك من من الطرفان أقرب إلى إبرام صفقة مع سينان أوغان؟
Yes, so the third party candidate, Sinan Oğan, who you just mentioned, polled surprisingly, about 5% of the vote. He left the MHP, the Nationalist Party, after the leader of the party, Mr. Devlet Bahçeli, made his coalition agreement with President Erdogan some years ago, and it's not really clear where his vote came from. It seems that a lot of it was a very nationalist vote. Some of it was just a protest vote. It's not clear at all whether he'll be able to deliver that 5% to either Erdogan or Kılıçdaroğlu, depending on whom he decides to endorse. My expectation is that he will probably end up endorsing President Erdogan, although I don't know that. We'll have to see what he does. But I think his views are kind of closer to Erdogan's really than to Kılıçdaroğlu, who's had to rely very heavily on Kurdish voters, particularly in the southeast, for his vote. And Sinan Oğan has essentially demanded that Kılıçdaroğlu kind of renounce the support of Kurdish political actors, which I don't think Kılıçdaroğlu can afford to do. So my expectation is that he will probably endorse President Erdogan. And how much of a difference that makes, I'm not sure we know.
لو أردنا القراءة قليلا في المستقبل، ما الذي يعني فوز أردوغان في الجولة الثانية لبلاده، للإقليم والعالم؟
Well, I think first of all, President Erdogan will see the vote as a huge endorsement. Nobody has made money in betting on Turkish politics by betting against President Erdogan. He's been enormously successful politically for 20 years now and has been the dominant figure in Turkish politics, a towering dominant figure in Turkish politics. And when you look at the timeline, I mean, if he gets another 5-year term, he will have been running Turkey, for instance, far long than Mustafa Kemal did when he established the Turkish Republic in the 20s and 30s. So he, I think, will see this as vindication, this election result. I think he will double down on the policies that he has pursued, both domestic and foreign. So I expect that you will see continuing economic policies that feature low interest rates, refusal to raise interest rates to deal with inflation, continued government spending to satisfy the needs of various constituencies that support him. I think on the international front, we'll see more of what we've seen so far from President Erdogan. I mean, certainly you'll see, I think, a continuation of his efforts to repair his relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with the UAE. That's been underway for some years, perhaps even with Israel to some extent. I think he will continue to have very tempestuous relations with Washington. I think that we're going to continue to have differences with him over the Turkish purchase of the S-400 missile system. I think we will continue to have differences with him over sanctions on Russia in the Ukraine war. But by the same token, I think there'll also be a disposition in the Biden administration to try and work with him on things like the Black Sea grain deal, for instance, and hope that he will be able to continue to talk President Putin into abiding by that deal. And I think there may be some view in the Biden administration that at some point, at the point perhaps where the combatants in the Ukraine-Russian war are both exhausted, that Erdogan might play some kind of mediatory role, assuming that the mediation that China has proposed doesn't bear any fruit, which I don't expect it to.
في المقابل، ما الذي يعنيه فوز المعارضة في الانتخابات في ظل برلمان يقترب فيه الحزب الحاكم وحلفاؤه من الأغلبية؟
Yes, it's a very good question. I mean, I think if Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu somehow manages to pull a rabbit out of his hat and win the runoff on May 28th, he will face a very difficult situation. In the first instance, one of his main promises to Turkish voters is that he would return the country to a parliamentary democracy and move away from the sort of presidential autocratic one-man rule that President Erdogan installed back in 2017. Of course, without control of the parliament, he'll be unable to do that. But even his ability to address, for instance, some of the economic issues, I mean, he will be able to control the central bank, but he will need parliament to help him rein in some of the social spending that the AKP government has indulged in that has contributed to the inflation. And I think he'll have a very hard row to hoe because Turkey will be facing an unprecedented situation of really divided government.
سؤالي الأخير عن الديمقراطية في تركيا، هل التجربة الديمقراطية في تركيا تستلزم الإلهام أم الانتقاد؟
It's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I've got a terrifically good answer for it. What I would say is that Turkish democracy has always been imperfect. When Secretary of State Dean Acheson in 1947 testified behind closed doors to the United States Congress on behalf of President Truman's bill to provide aid to Greece and Turkey during the Cold War. And it was being done in the name of the fight between democracy and communism. Secretary Acheson said that Turkey was a very imperfect democracy, and it has remained an imperfect democracy since two-party elections began in 1950. As I said at the outset, every Turkish government has had outsized influence during election season on the media environment in Turkey. That's been a long-standing flaw of Turkish democracy. But the elections have always been, if not fair, have always been free. And that's one thing that we're beginning to see erode a little bit in President Erdogan's Turkey. I mentioned earlier, for instance, that perhaps the strongest presidential candidate in the race might have been Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. but he was going to have a problem running because he's been accused of, completely, I think, fabricated charges of support for terrorism that would have perhaps kept him from serving as president had he been elected. So President Erdogan has essentially established what some people have described as a kind of personalistic system of rule by law rather than the rule of law. And what I would say is for those who aspire to more public participation, more democracy, which I think is a very natural aspiration that people around the world all share, I think the answer is to make sure that it's done with very close adherence to the rule of law and not rule by law that's imposed by one man or one party.
أستاذ إيريك، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you for having me.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.